there are two types of fear, right? So you have innate fear, which is a fear that you're born with that you don't have really any control over. It's just encoded in your genetic structure to be afraid of these things. And then you have learned fear, which are something happened to you to make you be fearful of something, right?
What does it mean for it to be a part of our memories?
Encoding memories and things like that, have been developed within the past 10 to 15 years. So research in the, even just this, since about 2000 or so has really come a long way in really understanding how these things work. In the early days, how they did this is they just started removing brain regions and see how that affected, behavior.
Kev Sattler is finishing his neuroscience PhD at the University of Utah. I'm very interested in the fact that Kev has degrees in not only neuroscience, but in philosophy and religious studies. What's going on, everybody? Welcome back to Woven Wings Live, where we bring you wisdom and tools for vibrant living. I'm Gabe Crane. I'm joined by my co-host Rahul Didwania. And if you enjoy listening to us on this show, please share it with a friend. You can leave us a review wherever you listen to podcasts. You can also follow along on our journey by joining our newsletter and following us on YouTube. All those links are linked in the show description of the episode. And today we have a really cool episode focused on fear in the brain, the neuroscience of fear. That is the topic of our episode today. And our guest is neuroscientist and fear memory specialist, Kevin Sattler, or Kev. And we are continuing our fear mini-series today. And I'm really excited, Rahul, with this particular episode because Kev, I think, is gonna drop the bombs on us, give us some science that really like what is going on with fear, neurologically in our brain when that's happening. So I'm really excited to dive in on the science of that. But I guess I'll just kick it to you. How are you feeling about our little fear journey here? And as what is our third episode, I guess, in our series here, what are you looking forward to today as we get in to talk to Mr. Sattler?
Thanks, Gabe. I'm really looking forward to the conversation today. I think overall, just talking about the fear mini series, I'm enjoying diving into this topic. I think it's taking fear, right, as this ephemeral idea and sort of demystifying it a little bit. And I feel like I've been exploring this concept from a few different angles, even outside of our shared exploration. Most recently, last week, I was running some training sessions on emotional intelligence, for example. And there, right, we're talking about emotion and what is emotion, what is a trigger, right? And what is the threat response or fear response that comes up in the body. And we were pretty quick on talking about the science of it or the physiological experience of it. But that is the starting point, right? It's this idea that we have these responses that are encoded in us, whether through some version of our kind of inherent wiring or kind of through our interaction with our environments and our experiences growing up, right? And that leads us to have these deeply embedded responses that show up in all sorts of different contexts that might not even seem connected to our original sort of the creator of that response. And I just find that idea like really, really powerful, right? That, hey, it's like, and I think it helps show up to any situation with more self-compassion and also compassion for others, right? That, hey, like these responses, fear just being one of them, but one of the biggest ones, they're deeply embedded, right? And sometimes we lose sight of ourselves within those responses. And so I'm excited to really build my understanding of what exactly is going on, at the neurological level. And then, what do we do with that knowledge, right? Once we know that these things are happening, what does that mean for us, right? And so, yeah, very much looking forward to that conversation.
Yeah, what you shared just sparks what I feel like are dummy questions, beginner basic questions. So if you're listening to this and you're kind of falling like, okay, yeah, I'm interested in fear, but like, wait a minute. So fear is an emotion. I know that sounds silly itself, but like, sometimes I think emotions are like these feelings, these ephemeral, I don't know, I feel this way. But here we're getting into the science, the biology of what it is to actually have an emotion, and that fear, this kind of primal fight, flight kind of experience, is, I guess, an emotion. It's related with, happiness, sadness. That's something that, one point of interest for me here. And I just think there's just so much for us to learn when we dive into the science of our bodies, of our minds. It can give us so much perspective and insight on these everyday occurrences that we're so used to them as, in our lived experience as humans, that we kind of take them as second nature. It's so valuable to kind of step back and take a look at some of these things in a deeper way. And so on that note, I do want to introduce Kevin. Kev Sattler is finishing his neuroscience PhD at the University of Utah. I'm very interested in the fact that Kev has degrees in not only neuroscience, but in philosophy and religious studies. He grew up in rural Arkansas, and after going to seminary and working at a church, decided to switch over to studying neuroscience at the University of Texas at Austin. And Kev's undergrad research focuses on understanding how the brain forms and uses fear memories, and his PhD research is more focused on understanding how the brain processes trauma and behavioral changes related to PTSD. And so there's a lot of knowledge that Kev has been diligently building up in his life, and a wide range of fields as well. But before going any further, Kev, welcome to the show. Thanks for making the time to join us today. And it's great to be with you. Thanks for being here.
Yeah, thank you so much for inviting me to be here, as well as just like giving me this platform to talk about both my research, my past experiences, and, kind of to hopefully eliminate some of the stigmas that we may have, surrounding this idea of fear, and mental health in general, that a lot of people kind of struggle with, and I think it'll be really cool to get to talk about this with you guys, where we're focusing on like kind of mindfulness and things like that. I think this is a really important platform for people to listen to.
Yeah. So just as a starting point, I would be curious, that the dummy question I just put out there at the beginning, like, can you orient us at the outset? So fear as an emotion, and then you also noted there fear as a stigma. And could you just give us a broad overview of like what is fear from your scientific perspective, and also why are we scared of it? Why is it a stigma? Why is it a problem for us in our everyday life?
Yeah, of course. That's a fantastic question. I think a fantastic like jumping off point to just really get into the nuances of all of this. So I love the idea of thinking about fear as an emotion. And it introduces this interesting caveat that like, so I, in my research, do, use a mouse model to study a lot of these things, and understand like the biological, processes that are happening. And one of the really cool things that we talk about at a lot of science conferences and stuff is whether or not rodents or non-human animals can even really have emotions, right? It's kind of like a uniquely human experience as we have kind of defined it in our society today. Whereas the effects of the emotions are very easy to study using, model organisms and things like that. So the main output of fear, in terms of like rodent research, is like a freezing response. And I'm sure we'll get to this whole like fight or flight conversation at some point in this topic. But there's this whole idea that animals can't have emotions, but obviously they can still show these biological responses to triggering events, right? So we can't ask a mouse how it's feeling in the moment, but we can still study the way that they respond to a given stimulus, such as a traumatic event, or a predator or something like that. And so one of the things I really want to start with is there are two types of fear, right? So you have innate fear, which is a fear that you're born with that you don't have really any control over. It's just encoded in your genetic structure to be afraid of these things. And then you have learned fear, which are something happened to you to make you be fearful of something, right? And I want to just distinguish one aspect of learned fear. You don't have to have a memory of the event to still carry the effects of that event. So, you may not be able to tell me why you're afraid of spiders, but being afraid of spiders is very much a learned fear. It's not something that you're born with. And in fact, in humans, so far, we've only really been able to determine scientifically two innate fears that we have. And that is the fear of falling and the fear of loud noises. And that was a really interesting study that was done a while back. I feel like there's some weird ethical concerns with it because they did use like children that were, like a year or so old, not old enough to have learned experiences. But they only showed physiological responses to those two things, falling and the fear of loud noises. And so it's really interesting that if you think about that, every fear that we can experience, everything that we're afraid of, other than those two things, have a learned and have a beginning time point. And in my brain, that's a really encouraging thought, because if you learn something, that means you can work with that, right? You can change, you can alter your memories. You can change the way, the way that you respond to things that you have learned about. And that gives you like this really cool idea that you have some control, over those types of fears once you really can kind of try to pinpoint at what point that those fears started. And so, yeah, I think when you're thinking about this as an emotion, I think fear really has a few different, I think it's like really three different points of interest. You have the mental aspect of fear. You have the actual physiological, biological aspect of fear. And then you have like changes in behavior following a fear response.
Yeah, Kev, thank you for that overview. I mean, just so many nuggets there already. And I think the one I really want to just linger on for a second is that basically all fear is learned, right?
Yes.
All fear comes from experience. And what you said around like, hey, we may not even remember the experience. I think that takes me to a few different places, right? I think one, this idea that, hey, we actually develop a lot of these fear responses when we're super young,
Yeah.
right? And it's pre sort of conscious or enduring memory, I should say. Or, the other context I've heard it before is like you develop a fear response and either that memory just fades because memories fade, or if it's tied to a particular trauma, sometimes that's the defense mechanism for the brain is to actually kind of bury it in a certain way. But the fear response, is still encoded. Am I tracking all that right so far?
Yeah, for sure. And I think what you said there also brings me up to something I really wanted to stress. And it's that, oh man, I totally just lost my train of thought. Well, hopefully that thought will come back to me. But yes, you're 100% like accurate in all of the things that you've said so far. I remember. So fear is not a bad thing, right? And I think this is kind of getting at the idea that, there is this stigma associated with like different mental health disorders and things like that. But fear is not bad. In fact, fear is 100% necessary for our survival, right? Taking like a stimulus, say you're walking down a dark alley and you get mugged, at some point in your life, and then later on you avoid dark alleys, right? That's because you've learned that could be associated with some type of danger. And obviously, in order for us to survive, you want to avoid danger, right? And so fear by itself is a really good thing. Where it becomes a problem is when your fear response is not, like correlated to the type of stimulus that you're receiving. Think in, PTSD war veterans that respond really highly to fireworks or something like that. Fireworks are not a scary thing. They're fun, and exciting. But when you have that type of trauma or fear response, you can't dissociate, good and bad things. And I just wanted to point that out because I want anybody listening to know that if they have like some kind of fear related disorder or trauma related disorder, it's biological. It's not something that you just, there's nothing wrong with you or anything like that. It's something that, your brain has just responded differently.
Yeah, that's
So
that's really helpful, Kevin. Sorry, just to come back to the build that I was working towards is like, so fear is learned, and what you're saying is the biological process within us is learning, right? Like the we experience something, and then the response to it becomes encoded in our memories, and so
Yeah,
then we might respond that same way to a similar stimulus, even if it's not exactly the same one. And so,
exactly. Yeah,
okay, got it. And so, can you help us understand? I realize I've been talking about this idea of like encoded in our memories, right? Or that it's a learned reaction to something. What does that mean? Like, what exactly is happening internally for us? Like, we experience something early in our life for the first time. We have, it sounds like fear is a survival mechanism, a survival response. How does it what does it mean for it to be a part of our memories?
yeah. So I'll start with the encoding aspect of this, right? This is something that's very well studied, and something that we do know a lot about. Obviously, this is still like really cutting edge in terms of like technology and science that we have available to us. A lot of this, the tools we needed to really understand, like, encoding memories and things like that, have been developed within the past 10 to 15 years. So research in the, even just this, since about 2000 or so, has really come a long way in really understanding how these things work. In the early days, how they did this is they just started removing brain regions, and see how that affected, behavior. And obviously now we know that that's not like a super good or ethical thing to do. But now we can, use these tools and these mouse models and stuff that we have to really pinpoint exactly what's happening. So let's talk about what happens when you are in the moment of experiencing a fear, right? So there's a lot of input going into your brain. You have your visual cues, you have your auditory cues, you have your olfactory cues, right? Everything you see, smell, and sense around you. So all of that information is being sent into your brain, right? There's a whole area of the brain called the visual cortex. It's all, taking in all the visual information, but the majority of this information is going to end up in the hypothalamus. And the hypothalamus is what's kind of in charge of your fear response. And it's really interesting because the hypothalamus can actually act faster than your vision, like can be processed in your brain. So like you can get out of the way of a moving vehicle before you even think about moving out of the way. Your body will respond to that. But all of this information is kind of being sent to one brain region called the hippocampus. And the hippocampus is what we know as like the central hub of memory, like learning and memory. And so what's kind of happening is we'll just keep it like a really simple like scale. Say you have 10 like brain cells in the hippocampus that are recording information that's happening around you. Like if somebody attacks you, what's their shirt color? What are they wearing? What time of day is it? Those types of things. And those 10 cells are in charge of remembering all of those types of things that are happening around you. Realistically, obviously, it's a lot more than 10 cells, but it's easier to kind of digest when you think about it like this. And so those cells are encoding all of the things that you need to know about that event, right? And then so after the event, those cells are now in charge of storing those memories, right? And so those cells, their entire job now is taking that and kind of just holding it in a place where if you need to remember it, they can be accessed again, right? And so next time something happens that's similar, say, like you were mugged by a person wearing a blue shirt. Next time you see a person wearing a blue shirt, those cells are going to like kind of activate, right? To remind you that, you maybe need to be wary of that type of situation. And so all of this is happening in the brain region. It's called the hippocampus is a really, really cool structure. It's really large and it takes up kind of a lot of space, but it's divided into two really important functionally different regions. So you have the dorsal hippocampus, which is on top, think dorsal fin of a dolphin. And you have the ventral hippocampus, which is on the bottom. And for a very long time, it was just assumed the hippocampus was this one structure that was, really important for learning and memory. But in reality, it seems like the dorsal hippocampus is what's really important for the like learning, like putting the context with the fearful information. And the ventral hippocampus, which is actually the brain region that I study right now, is really important for like emotional processing. It's taking that information that you now have memory of, and telling the rest of your brain like how you kind of need to act in order to respond appropriately. And like I said before, it's the respond appropriately thing that can sometimes get messed up with fear disorders or trauma related disorders and things like that. So the hippocampus is encoding those memories. Anytime that you are getting inputs that are reminding you of that thing, those cells are literally going to become active again. And I want to talk about something that I did as an undergraduate student, because this was really cool research at the time. It used to kind of be thought that, you have the fear memory. And when you kind of start eliminating that fear memory, when parts of it start becoming less fearful, that you were just forgetting, that those cells were forgetting the context that they were holding, right? But what in reality is happening is you have the fear memory, and you have the cells that are in charge of this fear memory. And then when you start to, become less fearful of that, you actually have a new population of cells that are encoding the information to make you less fearful, right? So one perfect example is, if you have like arachnophobia, one of the treatment options is to expose you to, spiders in a non-fearful way, right? So you can start by like talking about them. You can start by showing pictures, and eventually you can expose these people to real spiders to kind of extinguish their fear of those things. And what I found when I was an undergraduate student is that those extinction cells are very different than the fear cells, and they're actually in competition with one another. And so what will happen is, things like PTSD, for example, is what we call extinction resistant. So like even if you put people through that process of becoming unfearful of something, if a certain time period goes by following that, their fear can come back. And that's because they're still in competition with one another, the actual cells that are encoding these things. And the fear memory cells are stronger than the extinction cells, right? Because if you think about it, it's a very active event versus a very passive event, right? And so the strength of those, fear cells are just stronger than the strength of the extinction cells. And that's one of the reasons we don't have really good treatments for, fear-related disorders or PTSD and things like that, just because our brains still remember that fearful thing, even if we don't actively like have a recall of what happened.
So with regards to PTSD there, Kev, is the proposed or the idea behind the solution here that, we just need to improve our versions of exposure therapy? What are some of the emerging perspectives? Because, you talk about PTSD, we're talking about trauma. This has become, I feel like, such a buzzword and a focus area in popular culture. I coming from more of a psychology background, and when I was going through my training and even today, that is just such a constant theme that I see presented going on for people, and our understandings of trauma and what trauma is, like a big capital T trauma where you were in war and have shell shock and can't be around fireworks, to this kind of more developmental trauma, these everyday little T traumas that we encounter as we are socialized and develop and grow up, and then how that shapes us into all sorts of different responses as adults. I know you're researching this now, so what is your take on trauma itself and kind of our responses to it and how we can manage it and heal from it?
Yeah, I'm really glad that you brought this up, because I think this is one of the key components for trying to think about new like therapeutic options and things like that, to treat these trauma and fear related disorders. So I feel like where we're at right now with, treatment of these things is you kind of have, usually a twofold type of option or type of plan. You have a medical plan where they'll give you some, medicines, typically some type of, like Prozac, SSRIs that control the amount of serotonin in your brain and things like that, as well as like a therapy approach, right? Kind of, which is where like exposure therapy would come in. And I feel like right now we're treating PTSD as this blanket thing, and when somebody has PTSD, we give them the same treatment options that are available, right? But in reality, people suffer from different types of trauma, and different types of trauma or different types of fear experiences lead to different types of changes in the brain, right? I'll just give you one easy example that we study in the lab that I'm currently in. Social isolation is a really big problem, especially since COVID, um, and has a lot of biological effects and a lot of negative effects that can mimic and look like PTSD. But when you put animals through an isolation experience, which is a very chronic, like very long term, inescapable type of thing, versus an acute, like short traumatic event, they respond very differently, and their behavior looks very different. And so, in my brain, kind of where we need this research to be going is to pinpoint the biological responses for specific types of fears or traumas or events so that we can really target those specific things and have more specialized treatments. Like you could go into like your therapist's office or something and say, this is what has happened, this is what I've gone through, and instead of just being like, oh, we're going to start you on this medication, which is what they start everybody on, we can have this more idea of like, okay, you went through this, so these are the things that we need to do for you, as opposed to just like a blanket, oh, we're going to try to treat this and we're going to just keep giving you medications until one of them hopefully works. Which is kind of where we're at now. Like if you look into the history of any kind of like mental health treatments, they really have not changed drastically at all in the past, 100 years even, really. We've recently gotten some new like therapeutics with ketamine, for depression and things like that. But those things are very few and far between.
Yeah, it does seem like there's a lot more emerging interest in alternative forms of therapy. I know you mentioned ketamine, MDMA assisted therapy, especially for PTSD, seems to be in the news often. I know
Yeah.
recently it didn't get approved, if I'm not mistaken, and that's a whole thing. So just to make sure I'm tracking again, this is great, Kev. I just want to make sure I'm playing it back to you. So fear is learned, right?
Yeah.
And in our brain, we are encoding, in particular in our hippocampus, we're encoding the trigger that made us fearful and some of the information related to that, as well as an emotional sort of response, like how do we want to act in accordance or in response to that fear. Over time, the fear memory still lingers and has power, and basically is instantly activated as soon as we see anything that resembles some of those initial memories. And I think what you just added right now is actually that specific biological response that then emerges and after that recognition of fear is quite varied, right? And maybe
Yeah.
we've been treating it as more of a blunt response, but the nature of that biological response is going to be quite different. It's not one size fits all, depending on the very specific nature of what the trigger was, how long we were being exposed to it, what maybe our own kind of wiring is, and how we encode the response to it. And so just coming into that point in the journey, right? So if I'm now out in the wild, or just not even in the wild, I'm experiencing something that's triggering fear for me again, right? And in the brain, it recognizes that fear. What happens next in our body, right? So the brain recognizes it. What's happening overall? where does our like conscious thinking come into play? How is that impacted, right, by once we're in a fear response? We'd love for you to take us into all of that.
Yeah, I'd definitely love to. And I do want to. I've been talking about the hippocampus, and I'm a little bit biased, obviously, because I do study the hippocampus. The amygdala is also just as important for this fear response. There's actually a documented case of a woman who did not have a working amygdala. She lived a perfectly normal life for the most part, but she had zero fear. She couldn't uh, she didn't do like super great in like social situations because she didn't have any kind of fear response. She got mugged all the time, like just because she would put herself in positions where, she shouldn't really be in because she doesn't have this response that I'm talking about, where you have, the memory and you are recalling the memory and then your body is like telling, and making decisions based on those events, right? And so you're like, okay, I got mugged once. I'm going to now avoid situations where I got mugged. She didn't have any of that, right? She got mugged once and then she would get mugged again because she had put herself in the exact same situation. But biologically, what's actually happening is, like I mentioned to earlier, is that your body response to a fearful situation is faster than your like visual or other cues, right? And so the main area of the brain that's responsible for that is called the hypothalamus. And the hypothalamus is the area of your brain that's responsible for like producing hormones, as well as like communicating with the rest of your body, right? And so there's two really important things to kind of think about when you're kind of initiating a fear response, or two systems. So you have the sympathetic nervous system and the parasympathetic nervous system. Think of the sympathetic nervous system as the gas, and the parasympathetic nervous system as the brakes, right? So when you are in this situation that is really fearful and you kind of go into this, what we call fight or flight response, that's your hypothalamus telling the rest of your body, before you're able to make the decision on fight or flight, it's getting your body ready for this. So what's happening is it's sending all this information to your adrenal glands, releasing adrenaline, to prepare your body to respond however you decide that you need to respond. This is why you hear stories of like mothers being able to lift a car off a child because their body is being flooded with adrenaline from this response, right? Which again is faster than the visual response. So before you even like are visually aware that something bad is happening, your brain can be making this response. And then once your situation is done, obviously your body needs a way to stop all that adrenaline, from being produced, which is where the parasympathetic nervous system comes on. Like it basically will stop all of that and kind of return you back to a state of, of normalcy. And so that's kind of like the biological thing that's happening in terms of like getting you prepared, to respond appropriately. But once you're in that fight or flight response, it's these, memory cues and things like that that kind of allow you to make an informed decision, because obviously there are going to be situations where if you're getting mugged, for example, and the person has a gun, if you're like, oh, I'm going to fight, that is going to put you in like an evolutionarily, disadvantageous situation, where like you're unlikely to survive that if that's your reaction. And we can use, the memories that we have or the things that we have learned to kind of make those decisions.
So, Kev, I'm tracking back to what you said early in the conversation around fear is not a bad thing.
Yeah.
Right. And a lot of what we've explored here, I feel like since then, the last 20 minutes or so is, look, here's the way that fear is functioning through these different parts of the brain. Here's what gets triggered hormonally for you in response to different threats. Here's how memory becomes a learned behavior, which keeps you from getting mugged repeatedly, like the woman in the example you brought forward. I'm really curious to juxtapose that with ways that I encounter in the work I do within people seeking personal improvement, self-improvement, people on pathways more of spiritual development, where the language is often around overcoming fear, transcending fear, becoming fearless, kind of getting to this heroic, exalted, larger than life, kind of state that sells really well on the internet, right?
Yeah.
So, can you speak to this for us? I mean, like, what is a healthy way of relating with fear? If fear is not a bad thing, but some people experience themselves in maybe living smallly, if I really lean into some like the language that is out there on this, living within a state of fear and wanting to overcome that, wanting to transform themselves in some way. As a cold-blooded, warm-blooded, but also cold-blooded scientist here, what would you say to all of us out there who are trying to grow in that way and encountering fear inside ourselves?
Yeah, of course. So I want to make one distinction. There is a very big difference between taking something that is a fearful event, and processing it in a way that you're talking about to kind of help you overcome things like that, and having an actual like fear disorder, like PTSD, for example. You Nobody ever tells a person with cancer that they should just get over it, right? And I feel like this is something that's a common theme for mental health related disorders. If you tell somebody you're depressed, they're like, have you tried being happy? And that's not really how, these work. This is the same type of thing as cancer, where you have a biological problem, that your brain cannot process these things appropriately. Right. So I just want to make that clear distinction, that there is a big difference between, fear disorders and, just kind of trying to overcome like normal, this normal healthy fear that we're talking about. Right. And so I think if we're just going to focus on the normal healthy type of fear and kind of like overcoming and facing these types of things, let's say like public speaking, for example, right? A lot of people are afraid of public speaking. Um, I think the first step there is to acknowledge that you have the issue, right? And once you've acknowledged, you're like, I'm having this issue. I can't really do public speaking. Like I'm having this like biological response. My heart rate is increasing. I'm sweating. In some extreme cases, you even you're unable to speak. Things like that. Like the first step of that is acknowledging that this is something that you need to work on, right? And that's the step that a lot of people get hung up on. And I hate to like, especially, I'm about as white as you can get, but white men have a really big issue, with kind of admitting, that we have these issues that we need to, kind of work on and understand in order to overcome them. And so that's like the first step. After that, like I think seeking help is also a really big thing. People are all like, oh, you should only go to therapy if you're, you have PTSD or you're really depressed, or like all these things. A therapist's job is not to just make you better if you're having these types of problems. It's really to just have somebody to discuss these things with and kind of come up with individualized coping mechanisms so that you can improve, upon these things. Going back to the public speaking, if that's really a problem, like being aware that that's the problem, kind of taking the steps that you need beforehand to get in the right headspace, kind of like what we did, prior to starting the recording, centering yourself and getting prepared. The other thing is like, so we'll just stay on the public speaking thing. Like you've got to learn some confidence, you know what I mean? And that is a very teachable thing, I think. Like the more prepared you are for something, the more confident you're going to be. And so things like that are like small incremental steps that you can do in order to kind of overcome. You shouldn't try to overcome, being afraid of getting mugged, right? Like, please continue to be afraid of getting mugged so that you cannot, avoid types of situations where you're going to get mugged. But if you are on these like journeys where you're really trying to kind of overcome things like public speaking, or I'm afraid of the dark, or I don't, I really hate spiders, like all of those things, you just have to kind of go through this process of like acknowledging it, understanding that it is a biological response. I think that's one thing that's really important. That's actually helped me a lot. Since I've become a scientist, for example, I used to like suffer from sleep paralysis, which is really terrifying when you're, a kid, like in a young adult. But then once I became a scientist and really kind of understood the biological processes that are happening, I'm a very logical person. So anytime that happens now, I literally in my brain start thinking about what's actually physically happening. And that kind of helps me get out of that fearful state and into a logical state of what's actually happening. You kind of have to separate yourself from the fear for a moment. And if you think about what is biologically happening, it doesn't seem as scary, right? Like it's really scary if you have a lion in front of you, but if you start thinking about, okay, like my body is telling me to do this, it's telling me to do this for a reason. Like this, doing this is going to help like improve my odds of survival. It becomes less fearful and more about, doing what you need to do.
If I could just ask one follow up here, you're making this great distinction, Kev, between a fear that's good to keep having, right? That helps keep you safe, and then fears that are not, they're learned and they're, not really serving you. A fear of public speaking could maybe not be super consequential, or it could hold you back from things that you want to do and accomplish in your life. Um, some of that may seem very obvious. Maybe it has to do with like physical danger or things like that. But I think when we're scared, we get confused. You talked about confidence, and I know when I've been in fearful spaces in my life, I have trouble looking out and making a distinction between which of these fears should I be holding on to and which ones should I be letting go of and working to overcome in a process of, self-betterment. Do you have any suggestion for folks around ways to make that distinction? How can I know that the fear that I want to work on is a good one to try to overcome? And how do I know that this fear is a good one to listen to and to help kind of shape my choices and behaviors?
I love this question. And I think you actually answered it at the beginning of the question. It's about figuring out which fears potentially serve you and which fears potentially don't, right? It's trying to figure out which, what things are going to help benefit you and help you survive versus which things are just kind of holding you back. And I think this isn't always going to be something that you can do in the moment of the fear, right? Like if you're in that moment, like I have pretty bad social anxiety. When I'm in a social event and have this anxiety, it's harder for me to like kind of start thinking about it, in that moment. But, when you kind of separate yourself from that space, like later on and do some introspection, those types of things are more easily kind of digestible and, able to make those types of decisions. If you're afraid of public speaking and you want to be doing something that involves public speaking, obviously, that's something that you really need to work on. You're not going to solve the problem in the moment of having to give a public speech. But that's something that you can work on, throughout the months or years of whatever you're trying to do and accomplish. And so I think that's the biggest thing, just trying to figure out what is good for you, what's not good for you, and taking note that you can't make, this isn't like I've read a self-help book, I'm now cured, type of thing. It's something that you really have to work on. It's just like, training your brain, kind of to realize that things aren't scary and putting it back into a context of actually encoding a memory. Memories are very flexible. And I think this is something that a lot of people don't really understand. And if you even think about like the court of law, for example, witness testimony is typically considered very unreliable. And it's because anytime, like once, so you have, like I was talking about earlier, you have the cells in the brain that are encoding a specific memory. When those cells are dormant, like so you're not actively thinking about those things, that memory is very stable, right? But as soon as you start thinking about those things, as soon as something reminds you of that memory and those cells become active, other cells that are also active around the same like kind of space and time can then influence that memory, right? And so if I know I got mugged by a guy in a blue shirt and I'm trying to tell the police, that I got mugged by a guy in a blue shirt and I see a guy behind them in a red shirt, I may start to actually change the memory and I may be 100% convinced that the guy that robbed me was wearing a red shirt, even though there's evidence that that's not the case. And so memory is very flexible like this, which means if it's very flexible and most fears are learned, then you can kind of use that to your advantage. and try to retrain what you've learned to learn something new and change kind of like your mindset and the way that you think about the things.
I'm gonna, Kev, the clear train here is to continue down this road and explore how we train our brains, right, and how we kind of reconfigure those memories. And I'm gonna,
when you figure that out, let me know.
or maybe not. Maybe there's no answer to that yet. But that's one I definitely want to come back to. But the question that's been lingering for me as we've been talking about these different kinds of fear responses is I feel like the survival oriented ones that are like obviously survival oriented, whether it's fight the bear, run from the bear, freeze in front of the bear, make the bear like me, right? Fight or flight, but also freeze and fawn, right? We have those. Yeah. Those are, that's somewhat obvious to me in terms of like how that fear that hey, we've evolved, right, to have that survival mechanism. Running with the other example, right? Fear of public speaking, which, if I'm not mistaken, is rated a higher fear than like fear of death or something in the US.
Yeah.
It's like, how does that fear response develop, right? Something like what's happening in our brain? Like, are we equating, fear of failure, fear of public speaking, fear of embarrassment? Is our brain equating those things to death? If we're talking about survival response, right? Survival as the mechanism here. What does it mean to be fearful of these other things, right? Like, how is it that our monkey brain that's evolved over, the tens of thousands of years, like what's happening for it that it's responding to these, in my opinion, like non-physically threatening things in a way that's exactly the same as, being in front of a bear?
Yeah, no, that's a great point. And I think it's a question that is really open and, from a scientific standpoint, really difficult to study, right? Because everybody processes fearful things a little bit differently, right? So let's just think about like some statistics real quick. About 7% of people at some point will develop PTSD, right? About 70% of people experience something traumatic. And so you have this big disconnect that like something traumatic doesn't equate to PTSD, right? Or some type of disorder. And I think that's the same for things like public speaking, right? This is probably a combination of things that happened, when you were a child or when you were just younger, kind of like some of the things you talked about, is fear of embarrassment. And no, this is not, it's not the same thing as like a fear of death, right? It's a different type of anxiety and a different type of response. Because you're not always going to have that like fight or flight response every time you experience an anxious situation, right? But that doesn't make it any less like fearful. And so public speaking is not going to be the same as death, but that doesn't mean in the moment of trying to figure out public speaking that it's easy, right? You still have a lot of anxiety. You do still have a biological response, but it's very different. And so the answer to that, we don't really know, right? It's definitely something in development. There's a lot of studies happening right now trying to kind of pinpoint what the differences are between, experiences, when you are like an adolescent versus when you're an adult. A lot of people are looking at, PTSD, events versus, when you're young versus when you're an adult and things like that. But we don't really have a clear answer for that yet in terms of how your brain is making this distinction. But that's definitely, where the brain is going wrong, right? Is like somewhere in that, taking the bad events that happened to you when you were a child or something, whether you even remember them or not, whether you were bullied, whether, like, I don't know, my fear of public speaking probably started when I was in like third grade. And, you did that thing where everyone around the room is reading, and that you're going to have to read at some point, and you're trying to like count the students in front of you to see like which paragraph you're going to have to read, and then like rereading it just to make sure you don't mess up. Right. That probably all comes from like a fear of like rejection, or like your parents, never gave you accolades for doing cool stuff. And, so you're like constantly fearful of, that's when you need to be a perfectionist, right? Because if you're not a perfectionist, bad things are going to happen, right? Whether you're getting spanked or whatever, like your brain now equates non-perfection with trauma. And that's the association that you're making. You don't think you're going to die, but you do think that something bad is going to happen.
Yeah, it kind of touches to me. I mean, this example is very interesting because it seems like it touches on this kind of existential worthiness. The way you lined that up, Kev. Of if I don't succeed in this public speaking experience, then I will be a failure, or I will not have the love of my parents or of my friends and community. And I know that our brains have developed the way they are in large part because of our clan based nature, right? Like a lot of our brain development is due to our ability to hold complex relationships with 100 120 odd other human beings. And so is that potentially a part of it? I mean, thinking more speculatively here, I know that the research is ongoing, but are we terrified of being outcast from the tribe, of being seen as humiliated or embarrassed in front of our peers? Is that playing a key role when we think about a lot of these kind of more social fears that develop?
Yeah, that's a great question. And we're actually, like, one of the things that our lab does now is look at social stressors versus non-social stressors, right? So like the two stressors that as a lab we look at are social isolation, as I mentioned earlier, and foot shock trauma, right? So an acute traumatic event. Foot shock trauma is a very non-social stressor, right? There's nobody else involved. There's nothing else happening. Like, it's just you in a cage getting shocked, right? Whereas social isolation is a very social stressor. Rodents, which is why they're such a good model organism to study, are also very social creatures, right? They want to be with other animals. And so we kind of use that to our advantage to try to understand the social dynamics of human responses, right? However, it's really difficult because, rodent sociability is very different than human sociability, right? Like, I want to make friends because having a friend makes me happy, or going to movies with somebody, it's an enjoyable experience. Like, no other species really has those type of interactions, right? They're just like, oh, this is a family, like, we need to procreate, we need to protect the young, we need to, find food, we're safer if there's a large number of us, those types of things. It's not like, oh, I'm going to be social because I enjoy being social. And kind of like teasing apart those biological mechanisms has proven to be very difficult. Just because, obviously there's a lot of things that we cannot study using humans because they're unethical. And so it's difficult to kind of mimic those using other systems, at this point, to kind of get at some of those questions. But I definitely do think it, has something to do with like the evolutionary standpoint, where we've developed, kind of to interact with one another the way that we interact with one another. And when something happens that deviates from that, and we're no longer able to interact with each other like the way we would want, in a situation where I'm now anxious, something's obviously going wrong in my brain. And even though I may not be afraid of death, I am afraid of, whatever, however you being an outcast or, things like that, where now what I wanted to do is not something that I'm able to do because of the way other people act, have responded to me doing that.
Yeah, and I could actually see a connection, like the connection that you made, Gabe, resonates with me, right? That it's like, I'm thinking about, for example, like Sapiens, right? The central thesis of the book Sapiens is humans' one advantage was the ability to cooperate. And that's kind of what set them up, like to believe in myths and to use myths as a way to cooperate. And that was kind of the way we overcame not having physical advantages over a lot of our fellow animals. And I'm like, oh, I could see actually social isolation being linked to death, maybe. And
it really is.
But
like,
yeah.
There's actually a lot of studies so it's not just like a mental disorder thing. Like social isolation can lead to like heart problems. Like high blood pressure. All of those types of things, are seen, especially in the elderly people that are typically in those socially isolated environments. Not really having anybody to around them or help take care of them.
Yeah. So, Kev, I did want to pick up on that thread from earlier, if it's okay to come back to
Yeah.
that, right? This,
Sorry, I
this,
know I
I,
ramble sometimes.
no, you're totally good. Um, there's so many open threads, and I'm like, oh man, a lot of different paths to go down here. But the one I want to come back to, because I think it starts to get into, where we can find empowerment in this whole equation, right? Is hey, fear is learned, and what I heard is that means it can also be unlearned, right?
Yes.
If memories are encoded, but memories are also flexible, and so when we talk about that process, right, of overcoming, you can call it, or being able to coexist, right, with the fears that are encoded or recoding them in a different way. The process that I heard you sort of lay out, right, is hey, level one is, or step one is acknowledgement, it's awareness, it's being tuned into that fear, noticing when something takes us into a fear response, being able to reflect on that, notice the markers, right? Hey, I'm getting sweaty. I'm getting my heartbeat's going up. I'm getting tight, right? These are all fear responses. I'm just acknowledging, hey, this happens, right? And then the second was you said seeking help, or some combination of seeking help and really though help develop um, coping mechanisms, right, or ways to either relate to that fear different, to ground ourselves, when we're in a fearful moment, to kind of bring that conscious memory into play a little bit faster, maybe have some shortcuts around that. But also you said just to rejigger that memory, right? And so it sounds like we don't have a full answer to how we do that, but
Yeah.
I'm curious what the current research or even the anecdotal evidence points to, as ways to do that, as ways to kind of change our relationship to these triggers that are creating the fear response in us.
Yeah, no, that's awesome. And I'd love to talk about that, especially because we just did like a little mini project that's kind of trying to get at some of these questions. Um, the number one thing is having a good support group, and I know that like that sounds, like it's easier said than done. Like a lot of people have a hard time, especially it's really hard to make friends as an adult, right? But having a good support system is one of the things that is just like so understated in terms of like having to be able to deal with some of these things, right? For example, we the little mini project we just did was looking at how social interaction can actually alleviate a lot of the symptoms of PTSD and social isolation, right? So, we can traumatize the mice, which I know it sounds really terrible. But and then if you put those traumatized mice back in with animals, that where they're allowed to interact, the effects of that trauma are significantly less, right? And so having that, even just in a small like animal type of sense, having that support group is incalculably helpful, for trying to get at some of these things. And if you don't have like an individual support group, you don't have a lot of friends. That's literally why therapists exist. And I will die on the hill that everybody needs to go to therapy, just because like people, it's really understated, like just how helpful like communicating, some of the things that you're dealing with can be. Especially in a place where like the person that you're talking to is not going to judge you. They're not going to bring up all of these things you should have done better. They're going to really talk you through and help you through dealing with some of these things. And developing these coping mechanisms and strategies so that next time you're encountering that exact same fear, you have better mechanisms of understanding and getting through that without hopefully triggering that like really bad fear response. But I think that's the number one thing. It's just like having a good support group is so important.
I love that you emphasize that, Kev. I can personally relate to that. And you mentioned, especially coming out of COVID, this is a huge issue. And, I can just personally relate to it, not to, blab on about my personal story, but just because I feel like it is it's its own little emblematic version of something so many of us are dealing with today, which is, just not having access in the same way to people that we did a few years ago before the pandemic. And the movement of, so much of our work online. A lot of people moved during the pandemic. I'm one of those people. And I recently got involved with a outrigger canoeing club on Maui here where I live. And it's really interesting in light of what you're saying, because it's great in a number of respects. It's a physical activity. It's on the water. It's in nature. So it's really wonderful in those respects. But it's very social. It's a 6-person boat. It's a club. Several boats are going out. So you're having all these little interactions, and I'm not there talking to those people about my ins and outs of what I'm grappling with or struggling with. I'm just going paddling with them, shooting the shit, just having some light conversation. But something about that is incredibly nourishing. It just leaves me feeling so much more connected and confident, like just at peace in moving through the rest of the world. That I know what it's felt like in the interim, this kind of long COVID period since 2020, where it's just, you don't really have that as much. And so, do you have any suggestions for folks as far as how to get over that hump? And like you mentioned, going to therapy, one of the things that comes up for me with therapists, like when I go to see a therapist, which is, I'm with you, I'll be on that hill with you. We can die together. But I often also feel like, yeah, but you're my therapist. Like you're paid to do this, or like, this is your job, like somehow it's not real
Yeah.
in a certain way. How it's, as you said, it's really hard to make friends as an adult. So do you have any tips? Like, how do we do it?
For sure.
How
For
can
sure.
people get out there and actually build more of a supportive community?
I think the really important thing here is like everybody loves doing something, right? Like nobody, unless you're having some like, real problems, just wants to like sit there and not do anything. Like everybody has stuff that they enjoy doing. And for me, I'm not going out to party. Like I'm not meeting people like that, right? Like that's not how I make my friends. Some people may want to make their friends like that. But you have to find what you love doing, whether that's running, whether it's like, canoeing, like what you were talking about, or playing video games. Like you can make some really, seriously, I have online friends that I have met in person that I've known for years. I've gone to Disney with people that I play video games with. You just have to find what you enjoy doing, because there are also other people that enjoy doing that thing. And there is some evidence that suggests that, like, talking to people like how we're talking right now, like virtually, is very different than like interacting with people like in person, but it's still better than not interacting with people at all. And so, like, even if you're just playing video games, and chatting with people, like, you got to find that something that gives you the sense of connection. It doesn't matter what gives other people a sense of connection. If some people love having 45 friends. I don't like that many people, right? And so, like, I keep my group pretty small, and that type of social interaction is what I need, to get that kind of boost that you're talking about, where I can kind of recenter and connect with myself. Some people need one friend, and that's enough. You know what I mean? And like, so you just have to find what you're passionate about, and then find other people that are also passionate about that. Like there's so many. I mean, obviously, it depends on where you live. If you want to do stuff in person, but like I said, man, you can meet people online. I mean, don't do it in a creepy way, right? But like, there's a lot of different avenues where you can interact with people, even at a very basic level, and even just that very basic level can make a huge difference. In that study that I mentioned earlier about like trauma and sociability, even if you take like 4 mice that have all been traumatized and put them back together, like obviously they all now have issues, but even that is enough to like kind of eliminate some of the effects from the trauma. So like it doesn't have to be like big, it doesn't have to be grand, it doesn't have to be like, the super exciting, expensive things that you're doing. You just have to find what you like, and then somehow find other people that also like that. And I think this is why like religion became very big. I don't remember if you mentioned my religious background or not. I'm very not religious now, but if you talk to people who are involved in any kind of religion that have left that religion, the biggest thing that they usually miss is that sense of community that they got from the church. So you just have to find what gives you that sense of community and then just go with it. Man, people are weird. Like if you think you're weird, other people like that weird thing that you like also. So just like finding your weird people is enough to, really make a huge difference.
Yeah, and I really want to zero in on this what you said in that study, that hey, 4 mice that were had trauma or dysregulated, neurologically, that their trauma response, their fear response looked very different when they were together. And that's actually, that's a pretty like mind-blowing concept in a lot
Yeah.
of ways, that because a lot of what we've been saying up until now, right, is fear is a biological response. And even taking out the extreme, or I won't call it extreme, but taking on the disorder, taking out the disorder component, even for the fears of public speaking, fear of the dark, fear of failure, these more intangible ones, there's a biological response. And we're saying that being in community and having the safety of connection, use the word connection, whatever gives you connection, actually mutes the intensity of the biological response, presumably because you feel safety, right? And so that survival instinct is not as intense. I find that concept to be just truly like mind blowing, right? If you can
Yeah.
really internalize it. I wanted to pick up also on you mentioned also the other kind of bucket of just like developing other coping mechanisms and strategies, right? And I know one of the strategies that always comes up is just taking a deep breath, right? This idea that taking multiple deep breaths, in a moment of feeling biologically triggered and being put in that fear response state can actually have a neurologically calming effect on your system, and then give you a little bit more kind of access to cognitive faculties that are not purely fight, flight, freeze, fawn,
Yeah.
right? But like, hey, deliberate, conscious processing or thought. What happens when we take deep breaths, right? Or any other coping mechanisms? I'm curious what some of the other ones are, and like what's happening for us. How is it changing that fear response?
Yeah. So I mean, I don't want to. I do not 100% know what's going on biologically, in those processes. I definitely know that they work. One of the biggest things, and one of the things I wanted to mention, when Gabe was talking about kayaking, was that exercise helps a lot of things. And we know that, and it's not just like, exercising to lose weight, it's not really about all that, like exercising to have a good heart. If you're having like a panic attack, for example, and in the moment of the panic attack, obviously I'm probably not going to be like, oh, I'm going to go for a run right this second. But like running or doing any kind of like physical aerobic exercise is doing the same thing that you just mentioned. What are you doing when you're breathing or when you're running? You're breathing hard. And so it's just kind of like resetting. One of the things that I love, and that I think is very interesting, and this is because I've been having some real anxiety problems lately that I've had to like, kind of try to work through, is that your brain can really only handle one emergency at a time, right? So one of the things that you can do when you're having like an anxiety attack, and I'm not a medical professional, so please don't take this, like as I'm a doctor or whatever. Even when I get my PhD, I'm still not a medical professional. But if you eat sour candy when you're having a panic attack, most of the time your whole system will start to calm down because your brain is considering that like a new emergency type of thing, and so it has to like pick which one to act with, and that one becomes the more important emergency to deal with, and so it kind of like can calm down your panic attack because it's now like kind of processing, why is this so sour? Like, why are you eating this? What's happening? You know what I mean? And so those types of things can also like help with those events. And I know that sounds so crazy, but it does actually work. And there is like some scientific evidence behind those things. I don't want to just
Yes.
like, say things that there's no evidence to support, but that is one thing that you can do, in the midst of like something, severe like that, that can kind of help reset. But what's biologically happening, I can't speak to that because I'm not 100% sure.
That's super interesting. Yeah, so if you want your mark-off code for sour candies, this is our affiliate marketing moment. Not really, but we'll have to work on that. So yeah, so Kevin, we just got rudely interrupted by technology, spit onto Zoom here just to close out. But I was asking you about religion and like the deep meanings of life, man.
Yeah,
and,
right. Yeah, the important questions.
And your tatted up arm and everything. So, I was like, you lived a lot of life. I was just curious about how you might be able to relate this conversation we're having to religion, to your own sense of meaning and spirituality. I was mentioning about, this idea of fear of God. Also, sometimes fear works in nefarious ways, in church contexts. But yeah, is there anything that you could help us link to see that bigger picture between, life, the universe, and everything?
Oh yeah, for sure. Absolutely. I can just answer all of your important questions for you. No, yeah, it's definitely true. I grew up in very rural Arkansas, very conservative, like religious type of environment. And you do get a lot of like sense of community and sense of self, like in those types of spaces, right? But interestingly enough, now that I'm an adult, like I'm in my 30s, like I've lived all these lives that we've talked about. I saw they also use fear as a tactic, right? And I'm not saying that they're wrong or anything like that. I don't want to step on those toes, but fear is definitely used as a tactic to get people to agree, like across all religions and across like even politics and all of that stuff. Like fear is used as a way to get people to like side with you and do the things that you kind of want to do. And I think just being mindful of what, we've alluded to this quite a bit, being mindful of what fears are important and what fears are not important, what I mean, is really important, like, so if somebody's doing something to you and trying to use your fear against you, to do, either to do something or, believe a certain thing, like being aware that may not necessarily be a real fear that you're having or a real fear that's actually serving you, is really important. And I think all of this kind of just alludes to we need to be really mindful and kind of aware of what, fear is, and why fear is important, and the things that we need to do, to kind of deal with those things and understand what fears need to be addressed, what fears, are just there to help you survive, and those types of things. But like it all starts with being able to have these types of conversations, listening to a podcast like this where you're actually trying to like kind of become self-aware in a way, of all of these ideas that people that use your fear against you don't want you to do, right?
Yeah, I mean, Kevin, you're speaking our language there. That's one of our goals with this podcast. That one of the big ones is just to have these kinds of conversations.
Yeah.
I think we always come away with insights, with new questions that we want to explore, new energy, with which to explore some of those questions. And I appreciate your widening the aperture for us as we close out to talking about how people take advantage of fear, how they deploy fear, exploit fear, maybe harness fear. And I think that'll be some, great fodder for some of our future episodes. But being cognizant of time here, Kev, just want to say it's been an absolute pleasure. Really appreciate you taking the time and sharing your wisdom, your expertise, your knowledge, and just being a part of our project. This has been really rich, and I look forward to reflecting on everything we talked about today.
Yeah, I appreciate y'all letting me be here. I mean, this is a lot of fun. Hopefully I didn't ramble about things too long or, do the politician type of thing and avoid the questions that you were asking. I tried my best to address them.
Not at all.
Some of them just take a little bit of setup, to try to get to an answer that's digestible.
Yeah. No, I really, really enjoyed our conversation today, Kev. And, to your point around like connecting, it might not be exactly the same as in person, but I feel connected to you. I feel, inspired by what you've shared today and just appreciative of your overall approach to the depth of the science that you are researching and studying, and also your grounding as another person just like us, grappling with your own, anxieties, having your own history and experiences. And I just think that that is such an awesome, beautiful thing to be modeling and reflecting for all of us. So thank you for being you and for bringing all your expertise with us here today on the show.
Yeah, thank you so much, guys. I really appreciate it.
Awesome. So if you enjoyed listening to this episode, again, please check us out, follow us on YouTube, leave us a review wherever you listen to podcasts. You can join our newsletter in the show description. Continue following us as we go through this Fear mini-series. Listen to this episode again. I mean, Kev, I think, dropped a lot of really valuable nuggets there and a lot of things to really reflect and think about. So Kev, maybe we'll have you on again. Maybe this is the start of a beautiful, beautiful relationship. We can talk more about the church and manipulations and
yeah, we could do a whole religion episode.
Oh, I'm down. I'll talk to my co-host offline. We'll see where that goes. But yeah, so for folks listening to us, thank you so much for tuning in. As always, we love making these. Hope that it can be a model for you to have meaningful conversation in your life with someone, make a connection with somebody, talk about something that truly matters to you, that inspires you, or that calls you deeper into this beautiful mystery we have that's called life. So on that note, we'll see you guys next time. Thanks for tuning into Woven Wings Live. See you later.